All right, welcome to week 2 of watercolor painting. If we have any newcomers here for this class, what we are doing this month, we are calling it Mix It Up May. So we are all trying out new mediums that we don't normally do here on Chuck Jones in Your Home. So I'm doing watercolor, and we have another teacher doing collage, and another teacher doing charcoal. So if you want to experiment with that kind of stuff, you can come in on this class and we'll go over different techniques with these different mediums and practice working on them. So the last one I did was kind of like an intro to watercolor class. Today we are going to be working on landscapes. So you think of like backgrounds and painting those in watercolor. And then for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be working on an actual like illustration image. So if you want to drop in on some of those, you're welcome to. The previous classes are also all up on YouTube. So if you're curious about those and want to check those out, Scott, can we put the YouTube link in the chat for any newcomers that we might have? So you can reference those. Perfect. All right, so I'm just going to jump right in, because I'm going to try to finish the whole painting that I'm going to do today. But first I want to talk to you guys about when we're painting really anything. Here I'm using a reference photo that I took. So whenever you go out, like this was on vacation in Bryce Canyon, and I just took this with my phone. I'm not a great photographer or anything, but it does come in handy to have a library of photos that you can kind of pull from when you want to make your paintings or do any kind of work. So then you can always print those out, and then you don't have to worry about like copyrights or anything like that. And what you're also looking for when you're trying to pick a reference photo for a landscape, the main thing that I look for is the composition interesting? And then can I pick out a very strong background, midground, and foreground that are separate. So the reason I chose this one is because I have this little tree here that stands out kind of off to the side that's different from the rest of the surroundings. And then if you look down here, there's a very strong separation in light and in color with this amount of rocks, because this is on one side of the canyon and then this is the other side of the canyon. So we have a very strong foreground right here where it's very light, and then a midground over here, and then the background, which is very blue, and even this is all ground over here, but it's so far back in the distance that you're looking through more air molecules, and that's what makes it look blue. It's called atmospheric perspective, when things far in the background look kind of purple or kind of blue. So that's why I chose this one. I have very, very clearly defined areas that I'm going to try to capture in the painting. And then another thing I want to tell you guys is that this photo didn't quite capture exactly what this canyon looks like in real life. If you guys have ever been to Bryce Canyon, the rocks are very, very orange. If you've ever been on the ride Big Thunder Mountain at Disneyland, it's based off of this canyon. So those orange colored rocks, that's basically what it looks like. And I don't know something was wrong with the camera settings, and it kind of dulled that out with this area here. It made it more brown. So I'm aware of that as an artist. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to copy this photo exactly. I'm going to try to get the gist of the photo and beef up some of the colors, some of the oranges in this area. So if you're painting from a reference photo, just keep in mind that your goal isn't really to capture the photo exactly. I'm going to show you another one that I just did. This is the same place. You can see the orangey rock a little bit better here. And then I did a quick painting of it. So you can see here, I'm not capturing every single rock every single tree, you know, every single color gradients. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to get the general gist of what is going on in this landscape and paint that. So a lot of it is kind of blobs of color, especially towards the back. They get to be very, very tiny little color blobs. But if you look at it from far away, it will blend together and the background kind of blends into the back, so it looks like it's coming from a far distance. And then the orange kind of pops out against the blue. So that's the kind of things that we're going with. We're not trying to get an exact replication of the photograph. We're just trying to get the foreground, middle ground, and background, and kind of the like essence, if you will, of this landscape. So I'm going to do this photo here. If you want to follow along with your own photo, you can do that too. What I have done to prep is I have taped down my watercolor paper, and I'm using a small piece of paper, just hoping that it goes a little faster so I have less surface area to paint on. And normally on the landscape, I would do the paper the other way, landscape way. But because of this tree, the tree being very vertical, I decided to just do a vertical one for this one to kind of change it up a little bit. So if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to start sketching, and then Scott, can you put up, oh, you already did, you're ahead of me. So Scott has the photo that I'm using up on his camera, if you want to follow along. But if you want to paint your own image, you can go ahead and paint your own image. So when I'm doing this sketch, I'm doing the foreground, middle ground, background areas. I'm not trying to get every detail. I'm just trying to get the general size, shape, and placement of all the important elements that I'm going to use in my painting. And I may not paint everything, right? As an artist, you can kind of edit stuff out. So if there's parts of the paintings that you don't want to paint or you think might be too confusing, you know, you can just leave it out. You just don't have to paint it. We're not reproducing real life exactly. So I'm just trying to get the general shape of this tree and of these branches. And I'm going to be lightly erasing when I'm done too. I want to stay very light because I want the watercolor to be able to cover my pencil marks. And if I'm pushing down really hard, I'm going to gouge the paper. And then you're going to just see the graphite instead of the paint. So let's just say in general, that's kind of the shape of the tree. And now I'm going to look for my horizon line. That's this right here. So this is where there's sky and then there's ground. And it's pretty high on my photo here. I think I might even push it a little bit higher. Let's just say it's there. And then I have my red rock starting just beneath it. And it kind of comes down this way. And again, I'm not copying the exact shape that this canyon is making. I'm just trying to get the general idea. And there's all these stripes where the rocks has shadows all around here that make different stripes. And then there's a bush over here. So I'm just going to add that little bit of green. Okay, so hopefully you can see my sketch here, even though my lines are very light. Now I'm taking a kneaded eraser and I'm just lightly taking up the excess graphite. So for my sketch part, it's going to be really, really faint. I can still see where my lines are. I just don't want any loose pencil lead getting into my paint. This is why I also don't spend a lot of time on the sketch either. I'm just kind of getting a general idea of where everything's going to go. Because the watercolor is also going to move around a lot. You kind of can't always predict what the water's going to do. So I'm not going to get too attached to any of these borders. I'm just going to let the water kind of take it. Let's erase more of that out. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my image and I'm going to make a really quick palette of the main colors that I'm going to use. So I have some left over from the last piece I did, so I'm just going to add to that. Again, when your watercolor dries, you can always reactivate it with water. So I try not to throw out any paint or any palette that I didn't use because I can always just re-wet it. So I know I'm going to need blue. I have white, I have green, and I'm going to need orange. I don't have an orange paint tube, but I do have red and yellow, so I'm going to have to mix my own. Red. It's a different red. Sometimes you have different kind of reds. This red is more orange than this one, so that's what I'm going to use to mix my orange color with. There's a little bit of brown in there too. There's two kinds of brown that I have in my set, and your set may be different. But I have a yellow ochre, which is kind of like a darker version of this brown over here. It's kind of like yellowy brown. And that's what's over here. And then I also have a burnt sienna, which is more of a dark brown. Kind of like for the shadows, I think it's going to be a good for that. So I'm going to put some of my burnt sienna over here. And then I have a little bit of black over here and a little bit of white as well. It's always good to have black and white so you can mix different tones. And I think the first thing I'm going to do, because there's going to be so much orange, I'm going to try to mix out an orange. So I'm going to add water to this red. And it's kind of an old red, but I used a lot of it. I'm going to make a nice puddle. And then I'm going to clean my brush and add some yellow into my puddle until I think I've got a nice orange. And I forgot to wipe my brush off, so I got a little bit of the red into the yellow, but that's okay. Yellow is one of those colors that gets corrupted really easily. It's starting to look more orange though. And if I want to see what it looks like, I just have an old piece of watercolor paper and I can kind of dab on here and see what the orange looks like. And it's a pretty red orange, which is what I want. It's more on the red side than the yellow side. So I think that's a good place to start. And if I want to add more shades to it, I can add a darker color to it or a lighter color to it and so on. I'm also going to add some water to this green over here. I'm just shaking it off with my brush. The brush isn't even touching. I'm just trying to activate the dry paint. And I'll do the same thing with the blue. Now the blue here is light. It's not going to be like a full intense blue here. And there are two ways that I can get a lighter color. I can add white to it like you would with acrylic paint or any other kind of paint, or I could just water it down. I always start out, I try to start out lighter with watercolor because it's a lot harder once you put the paint down to get a lighter version just because of the nature of watercolor and how it builds. So I try to start out lighter and more watered down. And then as I go through and I get more detail on my landscape, I can always get darker and use thicker paint, so use less water. So you see over here, this is a really, really watered down blue, but it complements nice with that orange. So I don't really think I'm going to be adding any white to this. Okay, so I have the general colors that I'm going to be using for my piece. I'm going to have to add as I go along, but this is a good place to get started. I want to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is the background. And I'm going to paint that wet on wet. So what that means is I'm going to wet the whole area that's going to be kind of bluish. And that's going to help, again, me get a not so dark blue. I didn't totally clean off my brush apparently, but that's okay. And then that's also going to help the watercolor move around on this. So I'm just painting with water, and I'm going over the area that has the tree because the tree is very dark. My plan for that is to let the background dry completely and then paint the tree over on top of it with a very thick paint because the tree is almost black. So it's not going to be corrupted by having some blue with it. Now I'm adding the watered down blue. And for the sky, the gradient is very dark at the top, and it gets lighter and lighter as it makes contact with the horizon line. So up here, I'm going to add the like full strength blue and just kind of mix it in and let it blend in. And just keep going until I have a smooth enough gradient. You can even like push the puddles around with your brush to get them towards the edge, because I taped down my paper, I can just tape on top of, you know, the tape that I put down, and it's not going to leak through onto my paper. Now under here, it's very blue, but there are some browns and stuff going on with the background. I think I want to lean kind of towards purple on that. I'm going to do a tiny, tiny bit of crimson. And then make a purple. It's very red purple. I want more of a blue purple. Blue is very strong. I just tapped in once and completely changed the nature of this purple here. Now this is still wet, but I'm going to go ahead and throw some purple in. Just to give myself an area where the ground meets the sky. Then I'll go back later and add more details. Now you'll notice it's stopping here. That's because when I did the pass with just water, that's as far as I went. So the paint is really good about staying within the water that you put down if you're using a wet on wet technique. If you ever get too dark, like you put something down and you think, oh no, it's too dark, before it dries, you take a tissue and you can kind of blot it up with the tissue before it dries. This is good for like clouds and stuff like that. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry. Now, while that's drying, I don't want to keep painting all the way down anything that's touching, because if two puddles of wet paint touch, they're going to mix together. So instead of going for my midground layer, I'm going to jump down here to my foreground layer. And that's going to be mostly this yellow ochre color, very, very light yellow ochre. So I'm actually going to take some white and mix it in. I don't like using white a lot with watercolor. It usually looks better if I just let the white of the paper kind of poke through the way it is with the sky. But sometimes it comes in handy to add white. So this is a very light rock. Again, as a reminder, this is the part that I'm going to be painting. I'm just gonna paint it with the paper dry for this one. It's a bit of a different effect. You get a little bit stronger paint, and it doesn't move around as much. And then here's my tree over here. So I'm just gonna roughly paint around where the roots of the tree are, and then spread this around. Let's add some water. Yeah, again, I'm trying to start out very thin. Now around here, there's lots of little pockets of shadows and things like that, and light spots. I'm not going to get all of them. We're not going to copy the photograph exactly, but I do want to kind of mimic that shadow and the rocky texture of things. I'm just going to blot up a little bit of paint here on the top because that's where the light is coming down. So the light is hitting here and there's some shadow around here, and then the light's hitting here again.
To art class.
Do we have a question?
No, sorry, I just accidentally unmuted my mic.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, if you guys have questions at any point, if you're stuck on the painting that you're doing, feel free to raise your hand and Scott's going to help me out with getting to your questions. Actually, let's blot up a little bit here too. All right, so this is so thin, I think it's pretty much dry. So we're good to go adding some shadows. So I'm going to come over here and mix this brown with a little bit of that darker brown. See if we can get a nice shadow over here. It's a little puddle. That dark brown's really powerful. As you paint more, you get used to like the characteristics of some paints. So some paints like that yellow, you just tap in a little tiny bit of color and it will corrupt the whole yellow. So I'm going to go around and kind of dot in where I think the shadow areas are. And again, I'm being a little bit random with it, and I am looking at the photograph, but I'm not really like copying it exactly. Here, I think I'll get a really light yellow, because this is kind of the brightest, this and over here are the brightest part of the photograph. I always ask myself, what is the brightest area, the lightest area, and then what's the darkest area? That'll help kind of guide me as I'm painting. Needs more light. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that it's a little bit lighter over there. So now I'm going to let that dry. And over here, it's pretty dry. In the middle still looks wet because I can see how the paper is bunching up. But right along this edge looks like it's drying. So I can start doing the midground layer. So I think what was going on with this canyon, I'm standing over here on this side, and then this is the other side, it's pretty far away. And the stone is really red, and it goes all the way down into the canyon. So as the sun's going into the canyon, the light's bouncing off the rocks at the bottom and back onto this area. So this area, I'm going to try to make it a very intense, not very intense, but like a more intense orange. I'm partly going off of my memory with this as well. So I'm going to start over here where the edge of the tree is. And I'm just going to kind of paint around a little section, but I'm not going to touch my foreground because that is still wet. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space. And then I'll come back later and I'll paint over it. You always want to keep track of your like little color puddles and where they're wet and where they're dry, because that can make a big difference when you're painting. And I have a little green bush over here, so I'm going to leave space for my green bush. Now over here, I'm just going to mix these two colors together because not everything on that canyon is going to be the same color orange. I want some mixing going on with these layers. So it's going to look a little bit like a shadow layer over here. And I'm going to start out very vague and build up detail as I go along, sort of build up and build up. A lot darker over here. I'm also not swiping over the whole thing. I'm letting my brush create the texture that I'm seeing with the rock, because it's going to have some flat parts and some pointy parts and stuff like that. Let's go darker. I'm going to tap in some of that darker brown for the shadow area. The nice thing about rocks is when they go in stripes like this, it's easier to keep track of, and then they don't have any hard edges like a machine would. So you can be a little bit random and fun with your paintbrush and let that create the texture. So over here with this stripe, it is catching a lot of light. So I'm going to add some yellow. So the puddles of color that I make on my palette, they never stay quite the same. I'll paint a bit of it and go, oh, I think this needs more of whatever, more yellow. Then paint that. Maybe that's too bright. Kind of take it down a little bit. And then I'm going to add more water it down. And I'm just going to let these puddles bleed together a little bit. So some areas you can see they're already starting to dry because the paint was very thin, and then some areas are still very, very wet, and that's fine. It kind of gives a little more depth to the painting when you have some areas where the paper is poking through, and then other areas that are more thick. I'm just kind of pushing the paint where I want it to go and kind of guiding it. Looks like a layer cake a little bit. All the rock layers. And then I'll go back in later after it's dry and put in like the trees and stuff. Okay. I think this tree is going to go very last because I don't want it to bleed. It's always the issue when you're doing a dark color. You don't want it to bleed in with the lighter ones. I'm going to go and put this bush in over on this side. Now I can see some branches on this bush. Again, every bush is going to be a little bit different, but not very much. It's mostly the little like spines and stuff. So I'm just going to color this whole thing green, let it dry, and then I'll go in with a darker color and add in the branches and things like that. So this is just kind of how I paint with watercolors. I go section by section, and then I try to organize myself so I'm not painting two very different things next to each other when they're wet. And I try to go very, very fast on my first pass and use more watered down colors just so I get the whole thing. And then I can decide like, oh, maybe this needs to be more blue, or this needs more yellow, or whatever. And it's a little bit easier for me to see how the whole piece is going once I've covered the entire paper. So that's why I always go kind of fast. And you also don't, especially if you're painting wet on wet and you want that water to still be soaking into the paper while you're painting, you want to paint fast. So sorry if this is going too fast for people. All right, I'm going to work on this foreground layer over here and then close up some of that white area because it is totally dry now. This is not dry, so I can't mess with that. But this part's dry, so I can go ahead and work on that a little bit. Let's water down this color some more. This is the part where the sunlight is hitting it the most. So I think I can just add some white here and then blend it in. Just touch some white in and blend it in. So now it becomes more detail oriented. Try to mimic the shape of the rocks that I'm seeing. But again, I'm still only using, I have a much smaller brush so I can get smaller little puddles, but I am still just making little puddles, right? They're not super detailed. But when you look at it from far away and they're all blended together, it kind of tricks your eye into thinking the whole thing is more like a rock. Because this is a foreground, it's also going to have the most detail. That's another way that you can differentiate the background from the foreground. The foreground's going to have the most detail, midground, medium detail, and then the background will have the least detail. If I ever think I've gotten too dark, that's why I have this tissue. I can just blot it up with the tissue and then keep going. Actually, let's try the purple. So I want some even darker shadows. Instead of using black, I'm going to use the purple that I mixed earlier. Kind of blend those out. Sometimes black can be a little too intense and too eye-catching, and I want to save that for the tree. That's going to be my darkest dark is that tree. So purple makes a really good shadow color. So if I need an alternate paint to produce shadow other than black, I will use purple. Purple works out really well. So I'm kind of blending out a bit of the texture that I did, but you'll still see it as little blotches. If it's getting too blotchy, you can always just put in a different color and just let the water mix it together. Oh, I already had one over here. And then I'm just blotting up the light half. So you can get things to go lighter if you need them to. All right, this is dry. This part here is still not dry, but that's not right next to where I want the tree. So I'm think I need to put in that tree. So I'm going to activate my black by adding water. I don't know where my other towel went. Let's just use this. And I know it is a tree trunk. It's very dark though. I think I'm just going to tap in a tiny bit of brown. Sometimes I also will use green or something like that and mix it in with the black. So it's not like intensely black. But it just depends on what I'm going for. Let's add a little more water. So again, this is my first pass with the tree, so I do want it to be very, compact with the tree. I don't want it to bleed into anything else, but I'm going to start with just a light pass with it. Sometimes this is called a wash, when you just lightly paint sort of watered down color. And it's going to be jagged a little bit on this edge, but that's okay. I can go back later and fix it. I'm also not going to completely get the shape right from the photo. I am looking at it for reference, but I'm also just sort of letting this brush do its thing. And if I end up with a branch that goes differently than the photo, that's no sweat. It's fine. That's the nice thing about doing trees and plants and stuff. You don't have to get every branch. You can just kind of go where the water goes and it will still look right. Like, because this is my photo, nobody's ever going to go, oh, you didn't get that one branch, so it doesn't look like the thing. No. As long as it looks like the essence of a tree, it's fine. So what I'm doing here, there is green, like spiny things on the tree that I'm going to put in later. Right now, I'm just giving myself like the structure for it, and then I'll go back and put in the green. And there's a lot of them. I'm not going to nearly paint as many branches as there were on this tree. I'm just going to kind of go until I think that looks good. And then I'll stop. But yeah, this is why I usually go for the background layer first, because then I can just paint on top of that blue and I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to like go inside in between those branches. And then this is going to have to dry before I put they're not leaves, they're like pin needles. I have to let this dry before I put the pin needles on. This tree has some shadow area too over here, so I'm just adding little puddles of this black brown. And then I'll let it dry and go over on top of it maybe 1 or 2 other times until I think that it's saturated enough. But I think this is a pretty good start. Pretty good plan. Okay. All right, so I'm not nearly done with this, but this is a good like first layer. Before we run out of time, does anybody want to share what they've been working on, whether it's paintings or something else? Cool, we have Kat.
So here's this. I've shared it before, but I made some progress. So.
Oh, cool. I don't know if I've seen this yet. That's awesome. Let me switch views. Okay, cool. So is this going to be a full character design, or is this just like a neat costume design?
This is the full character design.
A full character? That looks super cool. Those all braids.
Mhm.
Yeah, that looks real complex.
They took me forever.
Yeah, I can tell. Yeah, braids are hard to draw. That's awesome, Kat.
Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen that before. I apologize if I have. All right, does anybody else want to share what they have so far? I'm just going to keep adding. And I was trying to do this fast so I could get most of the way through it. And I feel like I've only done like one layer. That's why the next painting is going to be 2 classes and not 1 class. So for next class, I am going to do an illustration. And it is one that I did before, but not in watercolor. So I'll show you that next week. So if you want to paint along with me, bring an illustration, and it's okay if it's one that you've already done. One of the harder things about watercolor is just picking the colors, because once you put it down, you can't really erase it or paint over it. Like you can, but it's a lot harder. So what I'm going to do is pick an illustration that I've kind of already figured out and just try to do it, but in a different medium in watercolor. So if you want to do that along with me next week, you can just bring either a drawing, or mine's going to be digital, like something digital that you've done, and bring your watercolors, and then we can try to do a painting with watercolor. And then I'm giving myself more time for that, because even though this stuff dries pretty fast, it is still taking me more than an hour to get this done. Let me blot that up a little bit. Okay, did I miss anybody or any questions? It's a little bit early, but there are lots of trees over here too, and they follow these layers in a particular pattern just because of how the rock is shaped. It's kind of like there's little shelves of rock. So I'm just going to dot, dot, dot little green trees. And get this at least looking more finished before class has to end. One thing I like to do is make a little puddle and then just like drag out a line or a couple lines. So that's what I'm doing here. It's kind of fun. Yeah, I'll add some more over here. It's not in the photo, but that's okay. As I go through more detail, I can use less and less water and thicker paint. And then can just build up the detail. And these little puddles that I'm doing over here are going to get smaller and smaller. And then what shows beneath is also going to affect the color that you put on top. So this is the same green as this, maybe because this had more paper showing. It looks like a different green. All right, are there any last minute questions about anything we went over? I know I didn't get to even nearly finish this thing, but I hope you guys learned something about painting landscapes. Yeah. Tomorrow, Lee is doing collage. Is that correct, Scott? I'm pretty sure.
I believe so.
Okay. All right. So
animal collage.
Animal collage, cool. Okay, so yeah, if that sounds interesting to you, be sure to tune into Lee's class tomorrow. And then Lillian and Heather, did you have your hands up?
Yeah, we were going to share what we.
Oh, excellent.
I mean, I can't because I taped my.
Oh, that is beautiful. Yeah, it's upside down, but I can tell what it is.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I don't want you to ruin it by tipping it or untaping it too quickly. So yeah, thank you for showing us. That looks really nice. You can tell just what it is. Let's see.
This is Heather Rose's.
That is awesome, Heather. Now, are you using photographs, or are you just painting out of your head?
We are both using the same photograph.
Both using the same photograph. Oh, cool. That's awesome. So you can see a little bit different color choices and a little bit different shape choices. They both look very nice. Thank you for sharing that. All right, any other last minute shares before we have to split for today? Yes, Taylor, you can absolutely show work in progress. I still consider mine a work in progress. Mine is not done.
Yeah, it's a digital piece that I'm working on for my brother.
Ooh, tilted a little bit. There we go. Oh, that's
Yeah.
awesome. Is
Thank
this a
you.
Krita piece as well?
No, this is Ibis paint.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is that your brother's character, or is that a different?
Yeah, it's my brother's Among Us character, Cheese, and yeah.
Ah, okay. That's awesome. All right, did anybody else want to share their work in progress for today? All right, awesome. Well, as always, the donation link was in the chat. So if you would like to donate, feel free to do so and keep these classes going for free for everybody. And then thank you, Scott, for helping me manage the class today. And then I will see you guys next week. Bring an illustration and we'll have fun painting together next week.
Thank you, Naylene. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.